Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. So I was on my Twitch stream the other day and we're talking about countries and things like that, and I learnt that Russia sold Alaska to the USA, and I could not believe it. I could not believe it. And we had to check out this video today because I want to learn about it. What the heck? How did I miss this, you guys? How did I miss this? But I always say you don't know if you don't know, right? So I'm looking forward to checking out this video today and learning about what happened. All I know is that Russia sold Alaska to the USA for super cheap, and apparently there was tons of natural resources in there, and Russia messed up big time. That's all I know. So I'm very much looking forward to checking this video out. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. So let's get into it, you guys. Leave any thoughts, comments down below, and let's get started into the video. Let's do it.
In the 1800s, the pristine wilderness of Alaska was a valuable source of natural resources for its Russian settlers, and the territory was a major center of world trade. And yet, at the height of the settlement's prosperity, the Russians would shock the world when they sold these lucrative lands to the young and territory-hungry U.S. in 1867, relatively for a paltry sum. In the decades since, Alaska has earned the U.S. back its purchase price hundreds of times over, with the hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue generated from the territory's natural resources, including
Russia, you messed up. Russia messed up.
Including fish, furs, timber, gold, and other precious metals.
Oh,
and of course, petroleum. It just might have turned out to be one of the worst real estate deals in history for the Russians. And it's enough to make anyone wonder why Russia had to sell Alaska to the US in the first place. Russia's journey to Alaska started back in the 16th century. In 1581, eager to spread their Orthodox Christian faith and to get their hands on lucrative fur trading lands, Russian forces pushed their way into Siberian territory known as the Khanate of Sibir, then controlled by a grandson of the legendary warrior Genghis Khan. Russia now controlled the area's vast natural resources and gained control of a large new group of taxpayers. And within 60 years of their first journey into Siberia, they had conquered the whole of Siberia and reached the Pacific Ocean in the east. It would take more than 100 years for them to start to look beyond their continent, though. In the early 18th century, Russia's Peter the Great formed the country's first navy in order to explore the coast and determine just how far east the landmass of Asia extended. It wouldn't be long before Russia looked to expand beyond Asia and across the ocean. In 1741, a Danish cartographer and explorer named Vitus Bering was serving as an officer in the Russian Navy when he was tasked with leading the first Russian trans-Pacific exploration. Bering and his crew set out from their staging point in the Siberian.
Can you imagine these? Imagine doing this way back then, honestly, in such cold areas like this.
Siberian city of Okhotsk and crossed the ocean via the straits that would eventually come to bear his name. At their narrowest points, the distance between Siberia and Alaska is just 51 miles, so it didn't take long for Bering to catch his first sight of Mount St. Elias near present-day Yakutat, Alaska. While his first journey had been a success and led to the discovery of fertile new lands, Bering wasn't so lucky on his second journey. He and his crew were caught in a fierce storm and shipwrecked on the Aleutian Islands, a string of volcanic islands off the coast of Alaska that separates the Bering Sea to the north from the Pacific Ocean to the south. While his crew worked to fix the ship, Bering succumbed to scurvy and died in December of 1741. Nevertheless, his crew filled their newly repaired ships with the furs of otters, foxes, and seals they had captured and returned home to share the news of the newly discovered land of riches. While they returned to Russia with their precious cargo, they so impressed the seasoned Russian fur hunters with their haul that they prompted something akin to the Klondike Gold Rush that would follow a few decades later. Russian settlers flocked to Alaska en masse in search of furs and fortune. At its peak, Russia's Alaskan colony was home to 800 intrepid settlers. The land may have been rich in resources, but it wasn't an easy place to live. Communication was a major problem, considering that they were half a world away from St. Petersburg and supplies were not quick to arrive from the motherland. They were also too far north for agriculture to successfully support a large number of settlers, so the Russians began exploring further south looking for other settlements with which to trade for food. Eventually, the Russians sent ships as far south as California, where they traded with the Spanish and even established their own settlement at Fort Ross in 1812 in present-day Sonoma County. By the mid-19th century, Russian Alaska, with its copious resources, was a center of world trade. And yet, Russian Tsar Alexander II would shock the world when he made the largest and perhaps the most foolish real estate deal in history. On March 30th, 1867, Russian envoy Baron Edward de Stokel met with U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward to broker a deal to sell 370 million acres of pristine Alaskan wilderness to the U.S. for the paltry sum of $7.2 million. The Alaskan territory was one-third the size of all Europe, and the price tag in today's dollars would have been just $113 million. In the years since this historic deal went down, the U.S. has earned back their purchase price hundreds of times over, thanks to Alaska's hundreds of billions of dollars worth of natural resources, including the furs, fish, walrus ivory, and timber that initially attracted the Russians, but also the copper, gold, platinum, zinc, lead, and, of course, petroleum that would be discovered years later. This has led to countless rumors about the deal, with some speculating that Russia only agreed to lease Alaska to the U.S.
Of course they're gonna try backtrack. Of course they're gonna try backtrack. I would try backtrack too if I were them. I would be very salty.
And that the U.S. refuses to give it back. Others actually believe that the U.S. outright stole Alaska from Russia. Despite these tales, historians from both countries agree that the sale was valid. But why would Russia want to sell such valuable land to the U.S. for such a small sum? Just 30 years after the first Russian settlers landed in Alaska, the sea otter population, which was the Russians' primary export, had been nearly decimated by overhunting, and the colony was no longer profitable. On top of that, Alaska was also incredibly difficult to support and to defend. All of these issues may have been surmountable, but for one major problem. In the 1850s, Russia was in the midst of the Crimean War, a brutal, bloody conflict with British and French forces over Russia's threats to European interests in the Middle East. Fighting a war required huge amounts of cash, so Russia was eager to
They needed the quick buck. The quick buck.
unload the struggling Alaskan territory in exchange for more money to help their war efforts. Unfortunately, the proceeds of the sale did little to help the Russian war effort. By the war's end, Russia had lost the war along with more than 500,000 troops, mostly to disease, malnutrition, and exposure, and the peace treaty crippled the Russian economy for decades to come, solidifying their fall from the ranks of world leaders in trade and exploration. The relatively young country of the United States, meanwhile, was undergoing a period of rapid and controversial expansion. The U.S. acquired Louisiana from France in the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, and in 1819 they settled a long-standing land dispute with Spain when the U.S. took control of modern-day Florida and the Gulf Coast lands in exchange for leaving Texas alone. Of course, this wouldn't last. After many failed attempts to purchase Texas from the newly independent Mexican Republic throughout the 1820s and 1830s, the U.S. annexed Texas in 1836 following years of bloody conflicts. With new lands to the south secured, the U.S. turned its attention to the west, starting with the Oregon Territory. By the early 1800s, Oregon was home to settlers from Spain, Britain, the U.S., and even Russia. But by 1845, the territory was firmly under U.S. control. Finally, they looked to the fertile lands of the southwest coast. And following a brutal 2-year war, Mexico ceded nearly 1 million square miles of land to the U.S., and the state of California was born. U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward would sum up the United States' prevailing expansionist mindset in 1848, when he wrote that our population is destined to roll resistless waves to the ice barriers of the North and to encounter Oriental civilization on the shores of the Pacific. Given this sentiment, it's hardly surprising that the U.S. turned its attention to Alaska next. Americans saw the potential in Alaska's resources, namely gold, fur, fish at the time, as well as the strategic position of the territory to facilitate trade with China and Japan. The U.S. was also concerned that Britain, their mortal enemy at the time, would try to establish a presence in the territory, and they felt that acquiring Alaska would help the U.S. become a major power in the Pacific. Not everyone agreed with Seward's position on Alaska. The deal was sometimes referred to as Seward's Folly, and Alaska earned the nickname of Seward's Icebox. But history would side with Seward, and Alaska would go on to become one of the richest states in the U.S. today. Alaska's abundance of natural resources had allowed the U.S. to earn back the cost of the purchase hundreds of times over, and the hundreds of billions of dollars earned on the state's resources allows Alaska to be one of the few states with no state-level or sales taxes. In fact, every inhabitant of the state actually receives an annual stipend from the state's massive resource income. Alaska is also the U.S.'s gateway to the Arctic and a key part of its defense system, with military bases located in Anchorage and Fairbanks. When the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia, relations between the two nations were cordial, and the U.S.'s biggest enemy was Britain. But today, the situation is quite different, and Alaska functions as the U.S.'s window on Russia and allows them to keep tabs on their adversary across the Pacific. Additionally, with melting glaciers opening more of the Arctic to resource exploration, Alaska gives the U.S. access to these potentially valuable lands and a seat at the table for these important ecological discussions. No conversation about Alaska would be complete without taking a look at the impact on the indigenous peoples who inhabited these lands long before the Russians or U.S. settlers arrived. When Bering first crossed the strait and arrived in Alaska, there were already more than 100,000 people living there, including Inuit, Athabascan, Yupik, Unangan, and Tlingit peoples. There were 17,000 people living on the Aleutian Islands alone when Bering was shipwrecked there. The presence of these people did little to dissuade the Russians and later the Americans. Early Russian settlers ruled over the native peoples with an iron fist, taking the children of the leaders as hostages to ensure cooperation, destroying the homes and hunting equipment of tribes to make them dependent on settlers, and selecting Christianized leaders to control the native populations. The Russians also brought new weapons like guns and cannons, which were foreign to the indigenous populations, making it easier to subdue any possible uprising. By the time Russia ceded Alaska to the U.S., there were only 50,000 indigenous people remaining in the territory, less than half of the original population. When the U.S. took control of Alaska, they were in the midst of the Indian Wars in the continental states, and they took a similar position on the native peoples of Alaska, treating them as potential adversaries. In the 1860s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs undertook a campaign to eradicate indigenous Alaskan culture, outlawing their languages, religion, art, music, and ceremonies. Native Alaskans were denied U.S. citizenship until 1924, and they could not vote, own property, or file mining claims. Even once citizenship was granted, it wasn't until 1945 that outright discrimination was banned. It was still common at the time to see Alaskan businesses with signs prominently stating, "No dogs or natives allowed." In later decades, some attempts at reparations were made. In 1971, President Nixon ceded 44 million acres of land and $1 billion to Alaska's native populations. Many indigenous people don't believe this is nearly enough, though, and they argued that the U.S. never had the right to buy Alaska from Russia in the first place, and that the 1867 treaty was merely the transfer of the right to negotiate with the native peoples from Russia to the U.S. Today, more than 740,000 people live in Alaska, 120,000 of whom are native peoples. Russia's decision to sell its Alaskan territory to the U.S. in 1867 may have made good financial sense at the time for a nation deep in the midst of an expensive war, but it would go down in history as one of the worst real estate deals of all time. If you thought this video was interesting, be sure and check out our other videos, like this video, called The Real Reason Russia Wants to Expand. Or perhaps you'll like this other video.
Oh, guys. Oh, jeez Louise. That's just horrible. Horrible decision. Oh my gosh. Imagine if Russia kept Alaska. Imagine how different this world would be. I always think about that. Different things in history. Like, if that never happened, our world would be so different. It's so interesting to think about. But yeah, that was very, very interesting. Again, it was only a few days ago when I found out that Russia, like Alaska was part of Russia. Like, I did not know that until a few days ago. So to learn about this deal and situation is very interesting. And for how cheap they sold it for as well, and the fact that they discovered petroleum later on as well, when it was already very resource rich in the first place. That's an L for Russia. Oh, what do you guys think about that? Let me know down below. Oh my goodness, yeah, let me know your thoughts down below, you guys. Thank you so much for watching with me today. That was really, really interesting. I'm really glad that I watched this and learned about this. This is fascinating, honestly. Very fascinating subject. And yeah, go follow me on Twitch if you haven't already. I stream on there twice a week, sometimes more. But yeah, if you wanna follow me on there, feel free. But otherwise, guys, I will see you all in my next video. Bye, guys. In the car, and I put it on my mama. And my bitch call, talking about some drama. I swear there ain't no time for women.